The question is that this House do now adjourn. Patricia Gibson.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. It is a real honour and a fitting tribute to have secured a debate on HMS Dasher, 80 years to the day when it was lost, a Royal Navy aircraft carrier which went down off the coast of Ardrossan in my constituency, resulting in the death of 379 people, the biggest loss of life of service personnel not to have been caused by enemy action in World War II, under the command of her new captain, Lennox Albert Knox Boswell. HMS Dasher had been involved in flying exercises on that fateful Saturday. She was both fully fuelled with 75,000 gallons of ship oil and 20,000 gallons of aircraft fuel, and carried more than 100 depth charges and at least 6 torpedoes. At 4:40, Boswell announced that the exercises were complete and the ship was to return to Greenock, where the crew were to be granted shore leave. However, this was not to be, and no one could have predicted the tragic events about to unfold. The Royal Navy Research Archive records that there was a tremendous explosion. The officers on the bridge looked in astonishment as the ship's 2-ton aircraft lift flew about 60 foot in the air before it fell into the sea behind the ship. The fleet air arm deck was completely destroyed, with the lift between the hangar and the aircraft blown sky high, then into the sea on the port side of the Dasher. The ship was plunged into deathly darkness as lights and machinery failed, and a strange silence descended on the fatally wounded ship. Within 8 short minutes, it sank almost vertically beneath the waves. Those who could abandoned the ship, jumping overboard from any point of exit they could reach as the fires in the hangar deck grew more intense. With oil burning on the water, many crewmen who had managed to jump overboard were caught up in flames when the aviation fuel floating on the water surface were ignited by the flames of the ship. Whilst help was quickly scrambled to undertake rescue efforts, the ship had gone down so quickly, with witnesses estimating it took no more than 7 or 8 minutes, there was little chance of saving those on board. Of a crew of 528, only 149 survived, with 379 losing their lives on that fateful day. To this day, the remains of the ship lies in the Firth of the Clyde, south of Millport, between Brodick on the Isle of Arran and Ardrossan on the mainland. To this day, the exact cause of this terrible incident is unknown. The ship was not under enemy fire, and there are no records of German U-boats or aircrafts in the area. At the time, the Westminster government ordered a complete news blackout for fear of damaging morale and fearing questions as to whether or not faulty US construction could have been a factor in this tragedy. As a result, local media was ordered to make no reference to this event. Survivors were also ordered not to discuss the events of the day. As a result, the many lives lost and the bravery of the crew and rescue teams has not always been acknowledged as they ought to have been. There has been speculation that the authorities ordered the dead to be buried in unmarked mass graves, but none have ever been found, and the Royal Navy insists that a mass unmarked grave would have been against Admiralty policy, and that all sources relating to the sinking of HMS Dasher are now in the public domain. Some of the Dasher remains recovered are buried in Ardrossan Cemetery, recorded by the War Graves Commission, whilst others are unaccounted for. And I pay tribute to the work of the late John Steele of Ardrossan, who sadly died in December 2021, and his widow Noring, who have extensively researched this tragedy and published their findings in a publication called The Secrets of HMS Dasher. They found that the official number of recovered bodies listed by the inquiry into the tragedy was far greater than officially indicated, and sought tirelessly to find out the location of any unaccounted for men. Sadly, despite the huge loss of life on HMS Dasher, or more likely because of the huge loss of life, this incident was undisclosed until 1945, when it was given a brief mention in the London Times. Bereaved families at the time of the loss of HMS Dasher were only told that their loved ones were missing, presumed lost, and it wasn't until 1972, when official documents were released, that details of HMS Dasher and those who went down with her were revealed. Yet the bereaved received no further official communication other than the telegram they had received in 1943, indicating that their loved one was missing, presumed lost. After this tragedy, an official board of inquiry was hastily convened, and within just 2 days it was concluded that the Dasher had sunk due to an internal petrol explosion. However, some argue that several key witnesses were not called to give evidence. The official cause of her sinking is still doubtful, but it seems the explosion most likely occurred in the main petrol compartment and was ignited either by someone smoking in the shaft tunnel or a dropped cigarette. The late John Steele and his widow Noreen spent long years interviewing numerous survivors of the disaster and browsed previously classified documents in order to better understand the ship's fate. This painstaking work led them to conclude that the ship was never suitable for combat operations and that it was a disaster waiting to happen. Shortly before its sinking, it was found to contravene more than 20 Royal Navy regulations, and significantly, that there was fuel splashing around the vessel. It's worth noting that the other converted Rio-class ships had alterations soon after the loss of HMS Dasher, and the amount of fuel which was permitted on board these ships was significantly reduced. Mr. Steele observed that what eventually spelled the end for HMS Dasher was its leaking petrol tanks. Sometimes the sailors could not return to their cabins due to the fumes. Just one small spark could have triggered the explosion, after which the ship took only 8 minutes to sink. Steele and his wife Noreen were determined to discover what happened to those dead who remain unaccounted for, and he continued to investigate the rumoured mass grave in which many of the dead were said to be buried. Sadly, Mr. Steele ended his days without finding out where those unaccounted for actually were, despite his tireless efforts to do so over many years. But I know many of the bereaved families are grateful to his efforts to find their lost loved ones and raise awareness of this terrible event. The site of HMS Dasher in the Clyde is an official protected war grave, designated as a controlled site under the Protection of Military Remains Act, and several memorials have been erected in the surrounding area commemorating the event and loss of life. On the 28th of June 2000, a memorial plaque was laid on the flight deck by a team from the European Technical Dive Centre. And it has to be said that every year the staff of Calmac ferries stop over the very spot between Ardrossan and Arran where the Dasher went down, allowing bereaved relatives and local veterans to lay flowers in tribute to those who were lost. And I want to pay tribute to that staff for the efforts they make to facilitate this. The wreck of HMS Dasher lies about 500 foot down in the Firth of Clyde between Ardrossan and Arran. And as an official war grave, it recognises, because the crew were unable to leave the vessel as it sank. But the mystery of HMS Dasher continues with the story of John Jack Melville, aged 37, who drowned, now believed to be may have been the real man who never was. Mr. Melville's body, so many argue, was used in Operation Mincemeat, an elaborate hoax to fool the Germans into believing Allied forces would invade southern Europe through Greece and Sardinia rather than through Sicily. In 2004, 61 years after Melville died, his daughter, Mrs. Mackay from Gala Shields, was able to give her father the memorial service he deserved with the help of the Royal Navy in Cyprus. The memorial service took place on board the current HMS Dasher, a patrol boat in waters around a British sovereign RAF base in Cyprus. This was undoubtedly the first tribute by the Royal Navy to John Melville, the alleged man who never was, and is thought to be the first time Britain's armed services have recognised Melville's role. The success of Operation Mincemeat was dependent on the provision of a believable, genuine corpse. It is believed that after Mr. Melville's body was recovered from the Firth of Clyde following the loss of HMS Dasher, it was packed in ice and place on board the submarine HMS Seraph for transport to the Mediterranean. There, his body was carefully dressed in the uniform of a Royal Marines courier, the fictitious Major William Martin, ensuring details such as labels were all correct and provided with false documentation to support the legend, including personal letters and photographs provided by female staff involved in the operation. Finally, the courier's all-important leather briefcase containing the false plans were prepared, ready for transport. And the hoax worked. Days after the body appeared on the Spanish coast, Winston Churchill received a telegram saying, and I quote, "mincemeat swallowed whole." In addition to saving thousands of Allied soldiers' lives, Operation Mincemeat helped further Italian leader Benito Mussolini's downfall and turn the tide of the war towards an Allied victory in Europe. And although many still speculate and disagree as to the real identity of the man who never was, many absolutely believe it was indeed Mr. John Melville. But tonight, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I hope that bringing this tragedy of the loss of HMS Dasher to the floor of the House offers some tribute to the strength of North Ayrshire and Arran's people by bringing the horror and devastation of the sinking of HMS Dasher to life, to commemorate the tragedy while also remembering and honouring those who died and those who survived, sometimes with physical or psychological injuries. The crew was part of a war against tyranny and made the ultimate sacrifice to protect our freedoms and democracy, and we must retell their story and pay tribute to them to ensure their memory lives on. Conflict continues in many parts of the world. This anniversary must remind us of those men and women who devote their lives to upholding democratic principles, principles that Ukraine is battling to defend as we speak. In North Ayrshire and Arran, we have a proud history of supporting our Army, Navy, Air Force and Marines, and I thank all the servicemen and women, their families and Royal British Legion volunteers who support our veterans and have ensured that HMS Dasher's sinking is properly commemorated, woven as it is into the fabric of Ardrossan's history. And I wish, Deputy Speaker, I wish I had time tonight to give a roll call of all those lost on HMS Dasher, but instead I will simply ask the Minister to join with me in paying tribute to all those who were so tragically lost that night so suddenly. The impact on the survivors is beyond anything we can imagine, and the grief of the bereaved families would have been profound and life-changing. And as I finally, as I prepared for today's debate, and in response to my early day motion number 969 on the 80th anniversary of HMS Dasher's sinking, I was contacted by David McIntosh, who himself was involved with the HMS Dasher Association for many years, and whose great-uncle, Cecil John Davis, ordinary telegraphist, was lost at the age of 21 when the vessel went down, now buried in Ardrossan Cemetery. This is a tragedy, truly, which is part of Ardrossan, and the memorial to the lives lost has a prominent place in the town, and I myself pass it regularly, sited as it is metres from my constituency office. The graves of these young men are also well tended in Ardrossan Cemetery and are treated with the reverence and the respect they are due. This is a special day of commemoration for the people of Ardrossan, many of whom I know will have reflected quietly on this anniversary and have a great sense of loss and grief across the town. To those who were on board HMS Dasher that night, to those who survived and to those who did not, I hope the Minister will join me in paying tribute to them all. We will always remember their great bravery and their ultimate sacrifice.